What's going on, guys? Welcome to the next Joshinator Soulsborne ranking video. To the surprise of many, including myself, 2020 has had me bored enough to actually go play through Dark Souls 2 a second time and relive every moment of that PTSD over again. As they tend to, my opinions have slightly changed, so why not rank all 41 bosses from easiest to hardest again? After all, I have to do something with the footage. Number 41, Covetous Demon. Most bosses in Dark Souls 2 pose at least some sort of threat, but not this one. Essentially just Jabba the Hutt on steroids, this boss spends most of his time flopping and rolling around in an attempt to steamroll you. Thankfully, moving in any direction at any speed gives you plenty of space to avoid these moves, and even if you are hit, he gives you a metric fuck ton of time to heal. Covetous Demon is the pinwheel of Dark Souls 2, you pretty much have to die on purpose in order to lose. Number 40, Prowling Magus and Congregation. Why is this even a boss? Seriously, if you take away the music and the intimidating health bars, this looks identical to any other ganky room in Brightstone Cove. What makes this boss so easy is that none of the enemies in this room can do anything all that dangerous. Magus himself has one weak AoE to keep you at bay, but that does essentially nothing. And from there it's as easy as any crowd control fight. Take out a few minions, back off to heal, rinse and repeat. If you somehow do manage to struggle with this boss, you can equip a sweeping weapon to hit more enemies simultaneously and use the benches to block their spells. Number 39, Dragon Rider. While I don't think that the Dragon Rider is a particularly bad boss, he sure is easy even for the second or third boss that you face in the story. The reason why he's such a piece of cake is that this guy is more blind than Vendrick. You can avoid a vast majority of his moves by effortlessly sticking to his backside and mashing away every few seconds. In addition to that, you can even trick him into recklessly stumbling off the stage. Not much else to say, this is a very straightforward fight. Number 38, The Last Giant. As you would expect, the first mandatory boss in the game is nothing to cry home about. The Last Giant's size may be intimidating, but it more often than not works against him. Most of his attacks have massive windups, and it's super easy to just roll under his legs and avoid the various arm swipes that do hurt, but unless you're dragging your feet, you shouldn't really be getting hit by them. Around halfway through the fight, he severs his own arm to use as a weapon with extra range. This fails to do him any favors though, because with a boss like this, you should be sticking to those legs like glue. Number 37, Demon of Song. After working your way through the god-awful Shrine of Amana, you're rewarded with a giant foreskin monster. This froggy abomination only takes any damage when his foreskin is retracted, revealing that gorgeous face and those lanky arms that can really dish out a lot of damage. I suppose you could struggle with this boss, but only if you're going about it wrong. Most bosses are designed to teach the player to stay close and dodge through attacks, but that's difficult to do with this amphibian, so I'd recommend keeping your distance while he wildly swings his arms around and then going in to get a few hits in between his combos. This strategy pretty much guarantees victory. Number 36, Guardian Dragon. It's a shame that the first dragon boss you face isn't much of a challenge. The Guardian Dragon behaves almost identically to the one that you encounter earlier in Hyde's Tower of Flame, back at the beginning of the game. And while his stats are considerably buffed, avoiding his attacks is quite simple. When he's stomping or swinging his tail, back away. When he flies into the air, you need to run to the edge of the arena to avoid the ensuing fire breath barrage. As long as you aren't greedy and manage to take him down quickly, this boss is mostly a cakewalk. Number 35, Old Iron King. Old Iron King is another big, intimidating enemy that really doesn't come through in the difficulty department. He has some of the longest, most calculated swings of any boss in the entire game, and if you are afraid of being hit by his melee attacks, you can always just back away and rush back in to get a few hits while he rests. The only real danger in this fight is being swept into the lava pit towards the back of the arena. If this is something that concerns you, simply lead him over to where the entrance of the boss room is, and it's virtually impossible to fall victim to it. Number 34, Skeleton Lords. Once again, this boss looks quite intimidating at first glance. Not to worry though, these bony skellies do pretty pathetic damage and leave plenty of windows open for you to mow them down. The caveat here is that each time you kill a lord, a mob of skeletons will spawn in its place. Thankfully, the mob is just as non-aggressive as its predecessor, and even if you are overwhelmed, you can always use the pillars to block incoming fireballs while you finish off the minions. One of the lords does spawn the dreaded wheel skeletons, which are certainly the most annoying aspect of the fight, but you can easily kill them as they rise from the ground before they even become a problem, rendering this another easy boss. Number 33, Flexile Sentry. One of the more unique fights in the game, the Sentry forces you to stand in harm's way, but you get to pick between two Siamese twins with varying movesets. The mace wielder is far easier to dodge than the other more erratic swordsman, so I'd recommend focusing on that side. You do have to be somewhat aggressive as the water in the arena begins to rise after enough time passes, but it rarely takes me that long to bring the sentry down. It's tough to get through this fight without taking at least some damage, but as long as you keep your greed in check, this is another boss fight that isn't too terribly difficult to overcome. Number 32, Royal Rat Vanguard. Pro tip, don't walk into this fight with a thrust weapon like I did. This is a crowd control fight, and you'll want to be able to hit as many of these vermin as possible to avoid being poisoned. The rats can also petrify you if you get hit enough, so it's essential that you can keep them at bay long enough before the true boss joins the fight. Speaking of him, the dude's a total joke. He sponges up just as much damage as the minions do, and his only distinguishing feature is a rather hilarious looking mohawk. Make like a good exterminator and take care of this pit of vermin. Number 31, Old Dragon Slayer. If this dude looks familiar, that's probably because he's basically Ornstein from the first Dark Souls, and he's much more manageable without the extra threat of Smo's brutal hammer. He does still put up a decent fight, and actually is probably one of the harder early game fights. His swings aren't particularly difficult to dodge, but it's a nice tool to teach new players how to face humanoid enemies with erratic movesets. This is another boss that I don't really have too much to say about. He's cool, but recycled from the previous game, and only really poses a challenge for new players. Number 30, the Rotten. After traversing the Black Gulch, you get to fight a literal blob of human corpses. The Rotten is sort of like the Dragon Rider in that he's easy to get behind and render essentially powerless. But if you do happen to get caught in one of his cleaver combos, you best be confident that your dodging skills are up to par. This boss can also hit you with a pretty annoying AoE and a grab attack that can leave you vulnerable for counterattacks. But all of these can be pretty easily managed. Just make sure you watch your footing and don't accidentally walk through the hot coals on the ground, because that can kill you very quickly as well. Number 29, the Pursuer. I remember my first encounter with the Pursuer. I thought I'd never beat him. But with time I've learned that this boss is more so designed to get you used to Dark Souls 2 rolling and combat mechanics rather than being a truly difficult boss. Most of his attacks are learnable, but he tends to have long combos that can catch you off guard. So while I certainly died to the Pursuer more than most other bosses in the main game during my first playthrough, this can be mainly attributed to the fact that you encounter him so early on in the game. Number 28, Mytha the Baneful Queen. Mytha is a boss that I still don't feel real familiar with, even after beating her multiple times. Before you do anything, you have to light the windmill outside the boss room to lessen the poison pool inside of it. When it comes to the boss herself, I struggle to come to a definitive opinion on her. Some of Mytha's attacks hit hard and don't have the most obvious tells, but she doesn't have all that much health, and I usually wind up killing her before she can do much of anything. My recommendation is to bait her from a distance into doing her spear charge and then deal damage back. Just watch out for her ranged magic attacks, as those are some of the more lethal in her arsenal. Number 27, Aldea, Scholar of the First Sin. As the final boss of the DLC, Aldea is a pretty standard fight. It's very scripted in that you essentially just have to dodge a few attacks, wait for the fire aura to extinguish, get a few hits in, rinse and repeat. I find most of Aldea's moves to be easily avoided, but if you're greedy and get hit by his fireball or fire aura, you can certainly die very quickly. And the fact that this could be the third consecutive boss you fight following Throne Gank and Nashandra makes it one of the more difficult ones to not die to at least once. Number 26, Nashandra. The final boss in the main game is yet another mixed bag. Nashandra primarily attacks with a few melee swipes of her scythe and a very predictable and easy to avoid laser beam. I do think she slightly edges out Aldea due to the added threat of the curse orbs floating around the arena. If you don't destroy these ASAP, you'll wind up with a health bar low enough for Nashandra to two-shot you. As long as you're able to multitask and deal with the orbs while dodging her attacks, this is a very manageable fight even if you are lacking in Estus after Throne Watcher and Defender. Number 25, Giant Lord. The Giant Lord is very similar to the last Giant, the main difference being that the dude has a giant sword. The strategy that I like to use is very similar. Stick close to those legs and roll through them to avoid his heavily telegraphed attacks. Despite the fact that he's extremely slow, this boss can be pretty dangerous due to a few reasons. First of all, he's so dang tall, making it extremely difficult to know when a sword swing is going to hit. You're also forced to fight him in a seriously tiny arena, so it's recommended that you stay unlocked for this fight and keep on your feet. Number 24, Scorpioness Najka. Quelaag 2.0 isn't quite as difficult as I remember her being. As you may come to expect, you want to be behind Najka, where you're safe from a majority of her attacks. While she does have a massive arsenal of different moves, she's very similar to Mytha in that I usually manage to kill her before I get to see her entire moveset. But I can definitely point out some of the more dangerous attacks that she possesses, those being the Homing Soul Mass, Tail Swing, and Toxic Telson Thrust. Her melee attacks are pretty straightforward and don't hurt a lot, so I just tend to trade damage when she relies on those. Overall, mixed bag fight that still leans towards the easier side. Number 23, Twin Dragon Riders. The title says it all. This fight pits you against the 39th hardest boss once again, but this time he has an archer buddy. I suppose this boss can actually be fairly deadly if you go about it the way I did. Even though their attacks are easy to dodge, fighting two enemies simultaneously with large hitboxes automatically sets the odds against you. Instead of trying to kill Mr. Melee first, I recommend running over to the archer tower and killing that Dragon Rider first. He has far less health, and bringing the fight down to a 1v1 pretty much guarantees that you come out on top. Number 22, the Duke's Dear Freya. I used to really struggle with this boss, until I realized one little trick that works magic. Bring a torch. Wielding a fire stick completely deters the infinitely spawning spider minions, allowing you to focus entirely on the Freya. As for the boss itself, she's no pushover. Her attacks do hit hard and tend to be more difficult to roll through, especially if you haven't been leveling the hell out of your adaptability. The gimmick here is that you can only deal damage to her head, but she actually has two of them. One where it should be, and the other one is on her ass. To best avoid her attacks and give yourself time to dish out damage yourself, I recommend alternating between these two targets for the best results. Number 21, Ancient Dragon. This might be a controversial spot for a boss that a lot of people would consider to be top 10 worthy. But while I agree that this is a painful, drawn-out fight, it's not particularly difficult if you know what you're doing. Ancient Dragon has two primary attack types, an earth-shattering stomp and a fire assault from the air. The fire attack will two-shot you regardless of how much you've leveled your HP, so this is an attack that you absolutely must avoid. Thankfully, this attack can't hit you if you run to the safety of the outer edge of the arena, so as soon as you see the dragon fly into the air, you need to start running. When it lands, try to bait the close range attacks and deal some damage. I think the main reason people find this boss to be so hard is that it takes forever to kill him, and it can be frustrating to die from recklessness 10 minutes into a fight that you need to conquer in order to obtain a giant soul. Number 20, Executioner's Chariot. I have to give the developers credit for this boss because it's one of the most unique in the entire series. While some may hate it, I actually think it's pretty cool, aside from the god-awful run-up to the boss room. In the fight, you must make your way through a long corridor as the chariot makes rounds in an attempt to plow you over. Eventually, you come across a lever that closes a nearby gate, allowing you to take out the chariot and bring the fight down to you and the horse. The more annoying part of the fight is that there are a bunch of skeletons occupying the corridor that can only be killed if you take out the various necromancers that are bringing them back to life. When the chariot makes its rounds, you pretty much have to hide in some of the corners of the area, and I highly recommend using a shield to block the skellies in this phase. Once you get to phase 2, it's really just a matter of beating a dead horse and watching out for its obnoxious back kick hitbox. Number 19, Lost Sinner. Man, this is one cool boss. First, I should mention that it's advisable to use a torch to light the arena before going in. As for the fight itself, it's pretty tough. If you don't use a shield, that is. Seriously, a high stability shield really trivializes this fight because the Sinner has some wild attack patterns that are quite difficult to learn otherwise. On top of that, she hits harder than many of the early game bosses, so I would imagine attempting this fight with no shield would be much harder. Thankfully, you can defeat her fairly easily with a strong shield, as long as you carefully manage your stamina and pick your openings to heal carefully, because the Sinner is super aggressive. Maybe next playthrough I'll try to beat this one the honorable way. Number 18, Vendrick. Vendrick is another tough boss to rank. How much you struggle with him depends highly on how many giant souls you collect, because he doubles his defenses for everyone you don't have. Even if you do have all 5 though, I must say he's quite tanky and his attacks hit like a freight train. Yep, this is another boss that was able to two-shot me when I got to him in my run. The saving grace in this fight is that the old king is blind and his attacks are pretty well telegraphed. As with the ancient dragon, it's difficult to not let your greed be your downfall when you're facing a boss with a huge health pool, but at the same time, can I really use greed as a reason why this boss is difficult? Number 17, Velstadt the Royal Aegis. After slogging through the undead crypt, you get to face the King of Bells himself. I think Velstadt is a bit harder than people give him credit for. Once again, he hits very hard, has varying roll timings with his attacks, and proceeds to buff himself around halfway through the fight. Thankfully, the buff animation takes a long time, which allows you to bring him down to his last legs before he starts attacking again. Still, this is a boss that I die once or twice to each playthrough thanks to his erratic moveset and hard-hitting hammer. It's a cool boss, but I do wish that the fight went on a little bit longer than it does. Number 16, Ava the King's Pet. The first DLC boss in the ranking still managed to crack the top 20. Not only is this fight tough, but it's also super badass. Ava has a relatively diverse moveset with several difficult to learn melee swipes, a devastating charge, and homing crystal missiles, from which I've learned the hard way that you have to sprint from them, not dodge through them. Add to that the fact that Ava is one of the more aggressive foes in the game, and you've got a pretty solid first DLC encounter. Of course, the fact that I didn't die to her in this run does show that she's quite learnable, but I did still have some close calls, and no small thanks to the questionable hitboxes she has. Number 15, Looking Glass Knight. This is another really cool boss, but like Ava, I find his hitboxes to be a bit inconsistent. The gimmick with this knight is if you happen to hit his giant mirror shield instead of anything else, it does no damage and your weapon gets deflected. It's also difficult to get behind him, so this boss forces you to get used to his attack patterns in order to be able to hit him. But the true difficulty of the Looking Glass Knight comes into play when he decides to be a royal asshole and spawn an NPC from his shield. Hell, he can even spawn a real player if there's any summon signs outside of the fog gate. That sounds absolutely dreadful. Thankfully, he didn't do this to me this time, but that's probably only because I was relentlessly aggressive in order to take him out before he could even attempt to do it. Number 14, Smelter Demon. Smelter Demon is quite infamous for being the toughest boss in the main game for many players, and while I certainly died to him many times in my first playthrough, he wasn't quite my hardest. That being said, this is still a very challenging foe that should not be underestimated. Smelter hits hard as hell, and his attacks have long range. And being that you're trapped in a small room when you fight him, it's essential that you learn the timing to dodge each and every attack that he possesses in order to succeed. He also buffs himself halfway through the fight, and after this buff, you take passive damage every time you stand near the demon. If you're aggressive enough, you might be able to have him at low health at this point, but if not, be ready for one hell of a struggle. Number 13, Throne Watcher and Defender. The penultimate boss in the main game is this ONS wannabe. Throne Watcher and Defender are both aggressive, hard-hitting enemies, and oftentimes in this fight, you're going to be praying to the RNG gods to give you a safe window to attack. Usually when I die to these guys, it's because they decided to be assholes and gank up on me when I try to attack. This fight is also difficult because if you kill one and leave the other alive for too long, he can go and revive his buddy. Because of that, you want to try to keep their health bars around the same level. All of this, in addition to dealing with a powerful pair of ganky Throne Knights, makes this one of the toughest fights in the main game. Number 12, Royal Rat Authority. This boss is seriously just the worst. When you walk through the fog gate, the first thing you'll see is a group of tiny toxic rats. Killing these is not exactly difficult to do, but killing them without becoming toxic and doing so before the Royal Rat Authority jumps down to join them is another story. Seriously, this fight is over in seconds. Either you kill the little guys in time or you don't. And that's not to say that the Authority himself is a slouch. His wacky body slam is one of the few boss moves in the entire game that I have yet to determine the correct roll timing for. And wielding a thrust weapon makes it a huge pain in the ass to try to hit his lanky little legs. This boss is pure steaming dog shit, and I tremble every time I reach the fog gate. Number 11, Sin the Slumbering Dragon. Some people seem to like Sin, but quite honestly, I'm not a fan of this boss. Sorry, he doesn't get a pass just because he's a dragon. Let's go through the list. He can breathe toxic breath, randomly hit you with oddly timed body slams, and never stops moving. Seriously, Sin has a habit of flying around and shooting fireballs at you for minutes at a time. And when he does eventually resort to melee, it's usually quite brief, giving you very little time to dish out damage of your own. I can't quite say that I hate this boss as much as number 12, but I do find him to be a bit tougher to overcome. Number 10, Belfry Gargoyles. And just when I thought that I was done talking about shitty ganks with Royal Rat Authority, now we've come to a boss that isn't just a gank, but also a reskin and an exact rehash of the Bell Gargoyles from Dark Souls 1. But instead of just 2 gargoyles, this time there are 5, and they all spawn at intervals that are way too close to one another. Because of this, you're most likely going to be facing 3 or 4 at a time unless you come in packing a ton of damage. Crowd control fights are annoying enough as is, but these gargoyles are fast, aggressive, and don't give you any time to heal when they're ganged up on you. Once again, this is another fight that I feel that I only won thanks to RNG, and for that I must repeat, praise the RNG gods. Oh, and the sun, of course. Number 9, Ruined Sentinels. Welcome to hands down my personal hardest boss fight in the base game during my first playthrough. I figured that going in this time I'd have an easier time thanks to my past experience, but nope, I still suck at fighting the Ruined Sentinels. This is another gank fight, but that's only really part of the fight. When you first jump down, your goal should be to use magic coating to kill the first sentinel as fast as you can, hopefully before the second even decides to jump up. If you can manage this, you should be able to focus on the second sentinel and then jump down when the third one comes up, so that you have more room to fight them. From there, it's a lot like the other gank fights in the game in that you just have to wait for a time to go in and dish out some damage, but there are just so many things that can go wrong in this fight, and I feel like I fell victim to each and every one of them. Number 8, Ilana the Squalid Queen. Ilana is a wild card because I actually think she's pretty easily handled when it's just her and the skeleton minions. All you have to do is dispatch the skellies while avoiding her dark orbs, follow her around when she teleports, and mash away. The caveat is that she can summon Velsta at any point in the fight to join her. If this happens, then this boss will definitely live up to the number 8 billing. In that case, how you go about the fight is up to you, but personally, when she did it to me in my first playthrough, what I wound up doing was killing Velsta and then going after her. But unfortunately, she spawned him a second time, so that didn't really help all that much. So with all that said, I'm super thankful that she didn't summon him in my most recent playthrough. And because of that, I didn't have too much trouble with her. Number 7, Burnt Ivory King. This is another beloved boss among the player base that I can't say that I'm a big fan of. Before you can even attempt this boss, you need to collect the 3 Lois Knights to accompany you in the battle to seal off the Charred Knight spawners. Otherwise, you'll have to deal with a horde of enemy knights at the same time as the king himself. Once you finally do get the king to join the battle, you better have some life gems handy because this is one long-ass fight. The king's attacks aren't horribly difficult to avoid, but around halfway through the fight he buffs his spear, which allows him to deal out insane damage, even being able to take you out in one swift combo. While I really do enjoy the fight with the king himself, the Charred Knights just feel like overkill to me because there are so damn many of them. Number 6, Gank Squad, or whatever the fuck the name of this boss is. You thought Royal Rat Authority was lazy? Well, try 3 NPC clones chucked into an almost completely open arena and call it a boss. Oh, and give each NPC a weapon to foil each strategy you may try to employ to defeat them. First, you've got the Ranged Bowman, sniping you from afar and spearing you with his annoying dagger when you get up close. Then there's the Samurai Swordsman guy, who's easily the least annoying of the bunch thanks to his stagger potential, but still a pain in the ass. And finally, a Havel clone with a ridiculous amount of poise that hits insanely hard and is only really vulnerable to backstabs, given that you have a strong enough shield to stop him from breaking your guard. The strategy that I use is to run the melee bitches around until they're a ways behind me, take out some rage on the bow user, rinse and repeat. Once you get it down to the 2 melee users, it's all about bait and attack, which is no fun and certainly doesn't make this anywhere near a fair fight, but it does work like clockwork if you're struggling. Number 5, Suralan. After bashing the Gank Squad for being the hot garbage that it is, I can finally praise what is probably the best boss in the entire game. Suralan is a powerful samurai with a variety of thrust and slash attacks, all of which are difficult to learn how to dodge, but never feel unfair to the player. I had hoped that my past experience would help me beat this boss more easily the second time around, but I still struggled for a while. In addition to his traditional attacks, this dude also has one thrust attack that gives him a massive buff. Even if it is only temporary, getting hit by this means that you'll be two-shotted by almost any of his combos, so you absolutely want to avoid being hit by this. Just as a side note, it really sucks that the run-up to this guy sucks, because the fight itself is so much damn fun. Number 4, Fume Knight. Like Suralan, this is another boss that is an absolute adrenaline rush from start to finish. Fume Knight has 2 phases, both of which contain deadly combos that challenge you to perfect your roll timings. But the real reason why Fume Knight is so insanely difficult is that he has a huge pool of HP. This is one of the few fights in the entire game that forced me to bring in life gems as a backup in case all of my Estus are gone. But good luck even making it that far, because much like any of the other top tier bosses, Fume Knight gives you incredibly sparse windows for healing. This guy is seriously just awesome, and besting him actually made me sad that it was over so quick. Number 3, Dark Lurker. One of the few gank fights in the game that actually feels like a fair fight, Dark Lurker is one hell of a tough experience. Phase 1 is actually largely manageable. The boss uses various well-telegraphed sword swings, AoEs, fireballs, and a rather challenging to avoid dark orb. The problem is that before long, Dark Lurker will split into two, so ideally you want to do as much damage as possible before that happens. Once he does split, it's a matter of multitasking. Traversing the arena without being hit by a flurry of attacks is difficult. Finding windows to attack during this firestorm is even more difficult. From my experience, the most dangerous situation you can be in is when the two halves are on opposite sides of the arena. If you can't view both of them on your screen at the same time, then you will have no idea when to expect incoming projectiles. Overall, this is probably my second favorite boss in the game and always manages to get the heart pumping. Number 2, Blue Smelter Demon. After making your way through the agonizingly stressful Iron Passage, you'll find Blue Kool-Aid waiting for you. Sounds like just a copy and paste of the regular Smelter Demon with buffed stats, right? Wrong. For every move you thought you had memorized for the red variety, the blue one has a completely different timing for. In addition to that, this boss has the unrelenting damage output of the Fume Knight, the speed and aggression of Sir Elan, and the devastating passive health drain that he applies in Phase 2 is absolutely the cherry on top. I know many people hate this guy for being a reskin with infuriating mechanics, but I at least like that they changed something about him for better or worse. I think I would appreciate being able to fight Smelter Demon twice in the game a little bit more if the Iron Passage wasn't such a slog to get through every single time you attempt this guy. And so we've come to number 1, Lude and Zalin. Welcome to the only boss and the only area in Souls history that almost made me give up. I know this list is about the bosses, but god damn it if the frigid outskirts isn't the most obnoxious zone in any video game ever created! When you make it to the boss, you're met with an Ava clone. The caveat here is that before long, a second one jumps in to join the fight. Winning the fight at this point is essentially impossible from my understanding, so it's important that you kill number 1 as quickly as you can. But for whatever reason, number 2 just didn't like me and continuously jumped down before I could do much of anything to number 1. Around 10 attempts in, I finally got good RNG and managed to kill Lude before Zalin decided to jump down. And just when I thought I was going to come out victorious, he proceeded to buff himself and arm swipe the fuck out of me. Needless to say, this was where I contemplated giving up. Thankfully, I managed to beat it sometime later, but this boss is absolute bullshit and quite honestly, nothing on God's green earth could get me to do it again. And there you have it. This is my re-ranking of the Dark Souls 2 bosses. If you want to go watch the video where I talk about them based on my first playthrough, it's back there in my channel somewhere. If you made it this far into the video, I just want to say a huge thank you because I spent a lot of time making and editing this. And I would very much appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Thank you so much for checking out this video, guys, and I will see you in the next one.